you had off air you had made a mention about hearing that I described myself as a classical Marxist and a classical liberal. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm a Marxist in that I think that the Marxist tradition is really powerful for understanding capitalism, and essentially that class struggle is one of the main, not the only, but one of the main motors of politics, and that my political concerns are with the well-being of the species as a whole, and I think that the way to achieve that is through class struggle. For the majority of people on this planet do not own productive capital. They have only their labor to sell, and so class struggle is about improving the conditions of the majority of people in any country and all over the world. And in terms of classical liberal, in many ways, the Marxist tradition it's in opposition to liberalism, but it's a kind of imminent critique from within. It's saying, well, that this whole liberal tradition is not, in fact, delivering on the promises of the Enlightenment. You've got to go one step further. You've got to have an economic analysis, and there has to be political economic change for the promises about human emancipation to become material realities for the majority of people. So in that regard, Marxism and liberalism, though they're often antagonistic, are also very compatible. And so, I mean, I'm a classical liberal in that sense, and I'm also a classical liberal in that I take civil liberties very seriously. And the abandonment by the American left of civil liberties is relatively recent, and it's highly problematic. It worries me a lot. I think it is foolish in a tactical sense, because civil liberties are useful for people and movements that protest and go up against power, and also because the kinds of freedoms embodied in our Bill of Rights are positive goods in and of themselves. The left's relationship to freedom, I think, has gotten misunderstood and forgotten. First of all, the left in this country, in the US, has always been at the vanguard of struggling to make the promises of the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And just a little interruption caveat, the Bill of Rights were not part of the initial Constitution. The Constitution is written, and then they can't get it ratified. The agreement is that 9 of the 13 new states have to ratify it, and then it'll become law. All the states agree that if 9 of the states ratify it, then all will submit to the Constitution. And when the Constitution is first rolled out, the populace read it and they see designs for a very, very powerful government and very few protections for people, civil liberties. And a powerful government is, in some ways, as I argued in my most recent book, Radical Hamilton, very useful for economic planning. But there's also the risk that it can run roughshod over people's autonomy and freedom and well-being. And so the Constitution couldn't get ratified without there being a promise that, well, there will be this immediate passage of these 10 amendments protecting civil liberties. And, the First Amendment protecting freedom of conscience and freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, very, very important. But also the Fourth Amendment protecting people in their person and effects against undue search and seizure. These are really, really important. And long story short, the left played an important role historically in making these rights a reality. So the First Amendment was not considered, it was a federal law, but it was not, states did not have to abide by it until really until I think it was like the early 30s. The dates are actually in the COVID article. But it was through struggles by the Wobblies, the radical syndicalists, trade unionists, communists, anarchists, that the First Amendment is quote unquote nationalized, made the law of the land so that it applies everywhere. Because at first it was just, you have these rights in federal territory, in Washington, D.C., in the territories controlled by the federal government. But states then had the right to suppress free speech and say, no, you can't hand out your pro-union literature. You can't stand on a street corner lecturing passerbys about socialism if you do, you're going to get arrested. It was struggle by the left, broadly defined, that made the First Amendment national. So that's an important thing that the left seems to have forgotten. But there's another aspect of this, which is that freedom has always been central to a left agenda. The point of a more egalitarian political economy, socialism, if you prefer, is to some extent that is merely an ends to something else. Economic equality is an ends to something else, which is human freedom, human emancipation, right? That underneath the struggle against war and imperialism and the struggle against class exploitation is the struggle for human freedom. That's the whole point, is that, that people can emerge from the tyranny of want into a realm of actual freedom and self-exploration. So that's always been there. And it has fallen by the wayside, at least in the US in this moment. I blame social media for a lot of that, but it's probably more complex than that. There's a new kind of censorious vigilantism that has taken hold. So that's sort of where I'm coming from on those kinds of questions. And in terms of other things, it's like, I mean, in many ways, my politics are boring in that I'm more focused on what is possible in the here and now. I'm less concerned with what the ideal society would look like. In a recent podcast, I was asked to describe my ideal political economy. And very honestly, it's not something I have thought much about. Mm-hmm. One reason for that is because it's really easy to imagine beautiful, wonderful scenarios, but so what, What's much more difficult is to imagine egalitarian arrangements that are within the realm of possibility, and imagining how do we get from here to there? What is a realistic destination in terms of social justice and equality from this situation? So those are the kinds of questions I'm concerned with. And if you're serious about that, it gets it gets quite limited quite quickly. So that's kind of boring, right? But my answer to such questions is not about reimagining the scale of human settlement and the integration of agriculture and home life and, high-tech manufacturing. There's all sorts of directions one could go in imagining a future political economy, but that all seems abstract given the obstacles we face here and now. And those obstacles are what concern me, less so than the place we might go if we can clear those obstacles.
And do you think so? Do you think some of these obstacles have kind of increased over the past few years, or or the older ones even coming back? Just because of the shooting of 2 days ago, I was thinking, this is like the conversations are so deja vu from 10 years ago. I know you weren't talking about that; you were talking about a lot of other things, but I just wanted to see what you think would be possible right now.
Yeah, things are pretty bad. It seems to me that the left peaked with the Bernie Sanders campaign and has gone into a strange and precipitous decline since then, as exemplified by the fact that Bernie and the squad all voted for this $40 billion of aid to Ukraine. And that is, that's disgusting at so many levels. This is an unjust proxy war. Ukraine is, according to Transparency International, a US State Department supported NGO, is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. So there's going to be massive theft. A lot of the money is never even going to leave the Beltway. It's just going to these pampered, welfare dependent military contractors. So it's a total waste of money. And it makes a mockery of everything that the social democratic left in the United States stands for. Climate, progress on climate change, redistribution of wealth, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that there was not a single vote in the squad against it is, call me naive, and I'll cop to it completely. It was shocking. I was genuinely shocked by that. I mean, because this war is bad for energy outcomes in that it's, going to create economic desperation around the world, which is going to make choosing more sustainable forms of investment more difficult and more expensive. The continuing this war will ramp up, intensify the building food crisis. So it is essentially a vote to condemn many, many people to hunger and even starvation. And none of that is good for progressive social change.